unless more and more of the American people get in touch with their elected representatives and say this treaty shall not pass. There's a real danger that this long cooked-up plan to create a world government, which will not, of course, be an elected government, is now about to happen. The words election, government, election, ballot, democracy, vote, words like that to do with making sure that we, the peoples of the world, decide who will run this world government, those words do not occur anywhere in the 180-odd pages of the treaty.
Danish Prime Minister Rasmussen said that Copenhagen should neither be a stopover nor a tiny stepping stone. What is he trying to do?
I think that what the aim originally was to achieve a substantive, binding, legal agreement to set up this world dictatorship at Copenhagen. That was clearly the intention of the original draft. Now I think enough people have made a noise that that is not so likely to happen. I think we're now going to get a much shorter, much more focused treaty, where, in fact, of course, there is still a possibility that sanity will yet prevail and no treaty will be arrived at all, because there's no need for one. One should never forget this. This entire exercise is totally unnecessary. There is no scientific case. And even if there were, there's no economic case, because in order to forestall just 1 Fahrenheit degree of temperature increase, you'd have to shut down the entire carbon economy of the world. That means virtually the whole economy, for at least 25 years. You'd have to have no automobiles in that time, no trains, no planes, no factories, no electricity, no elevators to get you up and down your block where you live, nothing at all, not even the right to light a fire in your Stone Age cave, because that too emits CO2. You'd have to shut down the world economy for 25 years just to forestall 1 Fahrenheit degree of temperature increase. And that's why none of this makes any sense, either economically or scientifically. The whole thing is pointless.
Why do some believe the man-made global warming propaganda? Is it the international government media complex who stand to gain from this? A world government, world power?
Well, of course, people like Al Gore are making a frankly illegal fortune out of this. I think he's eventually going to be prosecuted and indicted and imprisoned for racketeering, because that's what it is. So many people are now telling extravagant lies. And remember, the way it works in the financial services industry, a lie in court is one where you either knowingly say something which is untrue, and I think in Gore's case we can prove in 1 or 2 instances that he is knowingly saying things he knows not to be true. But also, if you pretend you know things to be true when you don't, that is also just as much perjury in court and just as much an offence against financial services legislation on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that before long, the more extremist scientists, the more extremist politicians, the people like Al Gore, who have been making not millions but billions at our expense by peddling what is essentially a false, and I'm going to say it bluntly, a fraudulent prospectus, by pretending that there is a climate problem when there isn't. I think in the end, heads are going to roll right across the governing class when prosecuting authorities eventually wake up and do their duty and lock these people up for lying to us, so that they could then tax us and regulate us still more in the way that every good little socialist always wants to do. Well, I don't think that the American public is willing to abandon its freedom that easily. And I think there's going to be an increasing number of people getting in touch with the police and the prosecuting authorities and saying, hang on a moment, this isn't right. Why should they be allowed to profit by lying to us? And when the first prosecution happens, you just watch all those little politicians and bureaucrats and scientists running for cover in case they get prosecuted too. It's only a matter of time. You heard it here first.
If nothing does happen in Copenhagen, if there's no agreement, where do you think we go from here?
I think gradually, if they don't get anything at Copenhagen, it's all over bar the shouting, because too many people now realize there has been no statistically significant global warming for nigh on 15 years. There's been global cooling, and quite rapid cooling at that, for 9 years. The CO2 concentration is rising at only half the rate that the UN predicts ultimately for this century. The sea ice in the Arctic which went down a bit in 2007, is 24% up on where it was then. Sea ice in the Antarctic has been growing for 30 years. The glaciers in the Himalayas, according to an Indian government report just out, are doing just fine, thank you very much. All of these scare stories that have been so sedulously peddled by the environmental correspondents of the media are being shown to be essentially nonsense. And it is quite extraordinary that for so long they've got away with this without anybody really saying, hang on a moment, the emperor has no clothes. But people are saying it now. More and more news commentators are beginning to realize that the biggest story in this is not the gloom and doom story of catastrophe, for which there has never been any substantial warrant in the scientific literature, but instead the story of how a small number of malevolent scientists and politicians in each other's pockets, politically and financially, spun up this ridiculous story into the giant scare that it so briefly became. But now that scare is collapsing, faced with scientific and economic common sense and truth. And so it's all over bar the shouting. If Copenhagen fails, and I hope it will, and I shall be there to try and make sure it does, then that's it. They won't get anything like a world government. They won't get a chance ever again at having a world government. This was their one chance, and they've blown it.
Changing topics, you're aware that I was put on a ban list from entering Britain by the Home Secretary at the time, Jackie Smith, and lumped in with terrorists and murderers. What are your views on this, and what do you think can be done about it?
Right. I, in fact, was interviewed for an hour a day before this happened. And a lot of people have said that it may be my interview that triggered the then immensely dim and over-promoted Home Secretary to ban, not because he's talking about terrorism, but because he's challenged this left-wing sacred cow, this shibboleth, this sort of god they've created of climate change. That's what they're really upset about, a whole hour to shooting down the climate rubbish, which they had hoped would be the Trojan horse to create this socialistic world government at Copenhagen. That's what they were really angry about. Now, I looked up the Home Office website today, and we're now, as we speak, around 6 months in from this ban coming into the UK. And this is what it says. Michael Savage, controversial daily radio host, considered to be engaging in unacceptable behavior by seeking to provoke others to serious criminal acts and fostering hatred, which might lead to inter-community violence. Now, that is plainly libel. It is not true, but it's being broadcast on the Internet by the Home Office and has been ever since May the 5th this year. Now, the correct thing, we have a law of libel still in the UK. You don't really have one in the US, but we do have one here. And what I think should happen is this. Should simply get some good London solicitors. They would then write a simple letter to the Home Secretary, whoever it is at the moment. I can't even remember. They're such an undistinguished crowd at the moment in the government. It's a collapsing government anyway. I should simply say, I require you to withdraw this allegation from your website because it is not true, or in the alternative, to say why you think it is true. That means they have to tell you why they have banned you, effectively. Now, if they don't tell you, then you simply lodge an action at the High Court for libel. That's the one to go for, because then they've got to substantiate the truth of what they're saying here. And I don't think they'll be able to do it. And so I think that the Home Office has gone way too far here. Admittedly, the Home Secretary at the time was one of the stupidest people ever to have held high office in the United Kingdom. She has now been sacked. But they haven't yet removed this nonsense from the website. And so I think that should not take this lying down. Should write to them saying, this is libel and I want it removed from your website. If they refuse, they must then explain. If they won't explain, should simply lodge an action for libel at the High Court. It's not particularly expensive to fight these legal cases over here, and would win for certain. The damages would be enormous, because if a government throws its entire weight behind attacking somebody simply because it disagrees with its political views, and that's what this is really all about. This is the left saying, we don't like anyone challenging our authority. That's what it's really about. It's a nasty political trick. Takes them to court and wins. The damages will be in the millions. We don't normally award large damages in the UK, but if a government moves against a private citizen in this way and throws its entire weight behind a private citizen and then cannot justify in court, in law, the truth of what it is saying in public about him, then that will be regarded by the court very, very seriously indeed, and in my view, rightly so.
Lord Monckton, thank you for joining us today.
And Michael, once again, it's always a pleasure to be on your program, and I hope that we'll have the chance of talking again, and I do hope that you will follow up this libel that appears about you on the website of the British Home Office. I think you would win that case, and in doing so, you would have not only struck a blow for your own freedom, but for freedom in this benighted country. No longer does anybody say in Britain, we are a free country, because we're not, and we'd like to be again, and you could help us.
I, Michael Savage, will be right back.